like I said, today we start the endocrine system, right? The endocrine system is one of your major control systems with the nervous system, control in response to stimuli, okay? The endocrine system, however, is much different than the nervous system, right? It performs its function in a longer term, right? It utilizes different substances to do it, right? And there's different functions overall, all right? So this picture just shows you some of the organs of the endocrine system. We'll talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary, the thyroid hormone. We won't talk about the heart, even though the heart does release hormones. We won't talk about the thymus, even though it does release hormones. Those two organs are not necessarily endocrine. They function in the immune system for the thymus and the heart and the cardiovascular system, right? And then we'll also talk about the adrenal gland, the pancreas, right? And the ovaries and the testes as well as the endocrine function. The ovaries and testes we won't get into too much because after winter break, right, in the second semester, we'll cover the reproductive system, which we'll dive into the gonads pretty more depth. Okay? So today, we'll talk about the major functions of the endocrine system. We'll talk about how it works, its structure. We just mentioned most of the organs. We'll define the terms hormone, endocrine gland, and we'll compare a little bit more than we already did, and the nervous system, the endocrine system in terms of controlling body function. And then we'll get into hormones in depth. We'll talk about the classes of them, whether they're steroid hormones or they're water-soluble hormones, and what the difference is. And that structural difference is important for how they work. We'll talk about the receptors that bind hormones and how they function. Okay, and we've already kind of touched upon these mechanisms in other lectures this semester. All right, so, and then we'll list and describe several types of stimuli that control production and secretion of hormones. Right, what I mean by that is how does a gland, like say the thyroid, know or is stimulated to release thyroid hormone? How does the pancreas know when to release insulin? Okay, it's in response to some type of stimuli. Where does that stimuli come from? All right, we'll talk about secretion in general. We'll compare paracrine versus autocrine secretion, what that means. And then we'll talk about the last two major types of eicosanoids and discuss their production and functions, right? So lots of stuff to get through today. First off, let's talk about general structure and function ideas of the endocrine system. Endocrine, that word by itself, means secrete inside. The word part endo means within. Okay, it means within. And crine means secretion. So the endocrine system, these organs, produce a substance that is secreted from the cells, and it stays and targets some other organ inside the body. The secretion never really gets outside or ends up outside the body. What's the opposite of endo? So like humans have an endoskeleton, and arthropods, like a lobster, has an exoskeleton. What does that mean? The opposite of endo is exo, right? So an endocrine gland produces a hormone or a substance that is released and stays inside the body. An exocrine gland is a structure that releases a secretion that ends up outside the body, like a sweat gland, like a salivary gland. Okay? So these endocrine glands are ductless, and they release their secretions, substances, right, hormones, into the blood. That's an important distinction. The definition of a hormone is a substance that is released into the blood and then target cells throughout the body. Okay? But the key there is that it travels via the blood. Okay? Where does the blood go in the body? It's not a trick question. Everywhere. Okay? So, if the blood goes everywhere, and say a hormone like the thyroid hormone is released into the blood, it can technically go everywhere. Yes? Okay. So now, every hormone, does every cell in the body respond to a hormone? Why do you say no? Ding, ding, ding. Right? The response of a cell to a hormone depends upon whether or not that cell has a receptor for that hormone. Okay? So, target cells are the cells that have the specific receptors. They will bind and can respond to the hormone that's released. All right? So, and then like I said, endocrine and nervous systems are your two control systems. Right? Both of them release ligands. Ligands, or these are chemicals or substances, whichever word you want to put in there, they're all the same, right? They're synonymous. A ligand is released from a set of cells, and it targets another cell. In the nervous system, those ligands are neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. Yes? In the endocrine system, we're talking about hormones. We're talking about insulin. We're talking about thyroid hormone. We're talking about cortisol, growth hormone, and you name all the others that we're going to be able to go through. Okay? The difference being, right, the endocrine system transmits the signals, the ligands, through the blood. Whereas the nervous system, the neuron, releases the neurotransmitter, and it only travels a short period to the effector. Okay? It will target the cells with any of the receptors, right? So acetylcholine can target muscles because it has the receptor. Okay, so that characteristic is shared between the two of them, right? Target cells only respond to the ligands that are produced if they have the receptor that can bind and work through that to that hormone. Okay, the endocrine system exhibits longer reaction times. Right? Nervous system, you put your hand on a hot stove, you pull it back right away. Yes? That's because you feel that. That's a nervous system response. The nervous system control is meant for quick response stimuli to help protect your body, and you'd respond to stimuli very quickly. The endocrine system is longer term, right? We're talking about minutes, hours, days, weeks, even months, even years. Okay? Right, so they have these longer lasting effects. All right, so here's a little picture that contrasts the two. Nervous system, obviously, neuron releases the neurotransmitter, binds to its target cells. Still have to have the receptor. Okay, the endocrine system, endocrine gland releases the hormone via the blood. It goes and travels to the target cells that has the receptor right through the blood. So here's a picture, or a table from your textbook that compares the two. Okay? So I would really suggest you look at this and you kind of you can create a number of different study questions. Ask yourself which one is endocrine versus nervous system control. Okay? Give yourself some scenarios in that and which one's which. So the major glands and organs of the endocrine system are found throughout the body, right? They're found in the brain as part of the hypothalamus and the pituitary, right? And so we have the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And here, this picture is putting the endocrine organs on one side, on the right, and endocrine containing, or organs that contain endocrine tissues on the right side. Right, so on the right side, you have a number of these organs that have endocrine tissues, meaning that they produce hormones and they can release them in the blood, but their overall function is not for the control of homeostasis in that way. Does that make sense? Okay, so we have major endocrine glands on the left, and then some some organs that contain endocrine cells on the right. All right, so major endocrine glands. The hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is kind of like the master regulator. It is part of the brain. It helps regulate homeostasis by controlling your endocrine system, right? And most of the time, the hypothalamus directly targets the pituitary, okay? So the hypothalamus is kind of a big endocrine organ, but it's actually derived from nervous tissue. That's why it's on that right side. Does that make sense? The pituitary gland, right, is a target of the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, right? And the pituitary gland is half derived from nervous tissue and half derived from epithelial tissue, and it produces hormones that will target and control other endocrine organs. All right, we have the thyroid. The thyroid sits in the base of the neck. It's a butterfly-shaped organ on either side. The thyroid gland helps to regulate metabolism. All right, the pineal gland, also found in the brain, that produces melatonin, helps regulate your sleep-wake cycles, your circadian rhythms, right, etc. The parathyroid gland, we've already discussed the parathyroids when we talked about bone during the skeletal system. We talked about bone growth, and parathyroids help regulate calcium levels in the blood, right, and they produce parathyroid hormone. The adrenal gland, small triangular gland that sits on the superior aspect of the kidney. They produce hormones that help regulate water balance, like aldosterone. They produce epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is part of your sympathetic nervous system response. They also produce another hormone called cortisol, right? Cortisol, important for stress response. And the adrenal glands will also produce steroid hormones, testosterone and estrogen, but in much lower levels than from the reproductive organs. Okay, and obviously then we have the reproductive organs, the ovaries and testes, which ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone, and the testes produce testosterone. All right, so lots of organs, and then on top of that, on the right, you have all these endocrine tissues that contain endocrine cells. The skin, right, will produce vitamin A, produce other hormones. The thymus, like I mentioned, right, is important for the maturation of immune cells. The heart produces a hormone that helps regulate water balance as well and helps regulate blood pressure. The liver, big in terms of regulating growth hormone production, helps regulate how part of your metabolism in terms of your cells in general. The stomach helps regulate your digestive processes, right? And these are organs that produce hormones that kind of, in a way, act locally. And that's kind of weird to say when I just said the hormones are substances that travel via the blood, right? But they act locally because the target cells only are the receptors for that particular hormone are only in certain tissues. Stomach, the pancreas is one that's kind of half and half. All right, it has a big endocrine function. What do you mostly associate the pancreas with? What function in terms of what? Insulin. What does insulin do? Right. So it helps regulate your blood sugar. And exactly right, it lowers blood glucose and moves glucose out of the blood into tissues. Okay, it helps regulate and lower your blood sugar. Okay, and it comes from the pancreas. And the hormone that does the opposite to that is glucagon. Okay, and that helps those two hormones together help regulate your blood sugar. But the pancreas is on this side because it has another complete function. Only like a third of the tissue that's found in the pancreas does insulin glucagon, right? The bulk of the other 2/3, probably even more, actually they produce digestive enzymes that are dumped into the small intestine that are important for your normal digestion of tissues. Okay? And then small intestine, adipose tissue, the kidney, right, all have produce some type of hormone and how it works. We won't talk about those in general. We cover those when we cover the different parts within other systems. So, what is the stimulus that tells a gland to release hormones? What's the stimulus for the pancreas to release insulin? I was feeling a little hungry after lunch today, and I was sitting in my office, and a couple students came by, and then I was like, oh man, I'm not feeling hungry. And I'm like, oh, I remembered. My wife, love her, right, bought me a jar of trail mix. So go on the desk, there it is. It's got peanuts and raisins and M&Ms and chocolate chips and peanut chips and yeah, blah, blah, blah. I feel better. Why would my body, what part of that would cause my body or my pancreas to release insulin? My blood sugar increases. Okay? That is the level of glucose in the blood or the level of something in the blood is one stimulus that will cause a hormone to be released. Does that make sense? Yes? All right. What other hormone have we talked about already this semester that is released in response to the levels of something in the blood? Parathyroid hormone, that's the hormone, is released in response to what?
Low levels of calcium?
Low levels of calcium, right? So the levels of calcium in the blood, it goes down below set point, and the body recognizes that, and the body starts to release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone targets osteoclasts to break down bone, and then the calcium gets moved from the bone into the blood. What happens to blood calcium levels? They start to go up. Okay, that's controlled by a negative feedback. That stimulus is what we call humoral stimulation. Okay, so right here in the middle, the release of a hormone in response to changes in the level of a nutrient, calcium, okay, or ion in the blood. What happens if you have a lot of, I see everyone with their nice little hydro flasks and your Owala water bottles, right? We drink, you guys are like really well hydrated, generation. What happens when you drink a lot of water? Tell me what happens. This is one of these lovely humoral stimulation. I'm going to use it as a hormone in a different way, but, right? So you drink a lot of water. What do you end up doing? What's the eventual outcome? Thank you. Right? You produce more urine. Yes? Okay. So water levels go up in the blood. Your blood volume increases. Okay? Your body, in response to those increases in water and increases in blood volume, releases aldosterone. Aldosterone helps lower your blood pressure by producing more urine. Okay? But the stimulus is not from anything other than the changes in the levels of something in the blood. Right? So calcium, insulin are probably the best examples of humoral stimulation. Okay. What else can stimulate the release of a hormone? Well, another hormone. Because the way the pituitary and the hypothalamus work, the hypothalamus controls the pituitary. And in turn, the pituitary controls things like the adrenal gland and the thyroid. Okay? So the hypothalamus produces a hormone, let's say thyroid releasing hormone, TRH. That targets the anterior pituitary. That's where those target cells are. And in response, the anterior pituitary releases thyroid stimulating hormone. So one hormone triggers the release of a second hormone. That's hormonal stimulation. Clear? Okay. When we talked about the autonomic nervous system, we talked about neurotransmitters that are associated with the sympathetic nervous system. What are they? What neurotransmitters are most widely associated with the sympathetic nervous system? I know it's before break, guys, but come on. Jackie! Acetylcholine, is that mostly associated with the parasympathetic or the sympathetic?
Oh, it's the
Help her out. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? Good. All right, so epinephrine and norepinephrine, we said are considered neurotransmitters because they're released from neurons. Where else can epinephrine and norepinephrine be released from? Do you remember the pathways for the sympathetic nervous system? The pathways to the sympathetic nervous system went neuron, preganglionic neuron, postganglionic neuron. There was a ganglionic pathway. There's the the splenic nerve pathway. And then there was one other one, right? The other one was the adrenal pathway. What happens with the adrenal pathway? The neuron, the preganglionic neuron, terminates in the adrenal medulla. It doesn't target another neuron. Remember that? Yes? That's what you see here. Okay? So here's the sympathetic nervous system, right? The preganglionic neuron comes down and actually finishes, there's no postganglionic neuron, it actually terminates inside the adrenal gland, within the part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. And in response to that nervous system stimulation, the adrenal gland releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. And if you remember, during our autonomic nervous system 1 lecture, I went through the neurotransmitters. We said epinephrine and norepinephrine are neurotransmitters, but they can also act as a hormone. This is how they act as a hormone. Okay, so 3 different types of stimulation to release hormones. Hormonal, one hormone stimulates the release of another. Humoral, which is some level of something changes, and that stimulates the release of the hormone. Usually the level of something in the blood. And then finally, nervous system stimulation, where I'm going to talk about sympathetic nervous system in that way. Okay? Questions on those 3 types? Cool. So, we've talked about a couple different hormones. We've talked about parathyroid hormone, we've talked about insulin, we've mentioned glucagon, we've mentioned thyroid hormone. What else? Any others? What other hormones can you think about off the top of your head? We're going to be here for the entire class if you guys don't start talking. I have 17 more slides to go through, and I can guarantee you I can get through them in about a half an hour if there's a little bit more interaction. Okay? I swear to God. Just trust me. Luteinizing hormone. Any others? What other hormones do you know? Yes. Progesterone. Testosterone. Thank you. Estrogen? Yes, okay. You get a hormone. Everyone gets a hormone, right? So all of the hormones that we've talked about can be categorized in different classes based upon their structure, okay? And basically, we can actually split them into 2 parts, right? So we've actually said there's this line like this, right? So this side versus that side. So if different types of circulating hormones, basically they could be divided whether or not they're water soluble or not. Okay? So water soluble hormones, right? Their blood is basically an aqueous, watery solution, and so they are solubilized. They're in the blood, no problems. Okay? But fat soluble or lipid soluble hormones, what do we know about oil and water? They don't mix. Okay? So in order for these hormones to travel via the blood, they have to have like a carrier protein, and they don't do well in a watery solution. Make sense? Okay. So lipid soluble hormones are derived from cholesterol. That's the structure of cholesterol, and basically these three 6-member rings and a 5-member ring is basically the backbone for progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen. Okay, so testosterone is change a couple of the side chains. You got it back there. Change a couple more of the side chains, and you can convert testosterone to estrogen. And progesterone's a little bit funkier. Okay, but those are lipid soluble, right? Cortisol is part of that as well. Aldosterone, those are from the adrenal gland, right? Those are lipid soluble hormones. Okay. Water soluble hormones include the biogenic amines, which are epinephrine and norepinephrine. Thyroid hormone is going to be the weird one because it's water soluble, but it actually functions and acts quite a bit like a lipid soluble hormone. Okay, and then you have other proteins such as ADH, insulin, glucagon, growth hormone, and erythropoietin, right, are proteins. So what do you remember about the cell membrane in terms of lipid-soluble molecules versus water-soluble molecules? What's the cell membrane made up of? It's a phospholipid bilayer. And that phospholipid bilayer has a hydrophilic part and a hydrophobic part. Yes? Okay? And that hydrophobic part is right in the middle. Okay? And the hydrophilic parts are on either side of the membrane. So what doesn't like to happen is polar molecules don't pass through. Okay? The cell membrane is designed to not let water, like an aqueous solution that's outside the cell, pass into the aqueous solution that's inside the cell. That's why it produces, it's a boundary, that's why it's a membrane. Does that make sense? So these water-soluble molecules, they do not pass the membrane. So where must the receptor for these hormones be located? Inside the cell or facing outside the cell? What do you think? They have to face from outside the cell. Okay, because the water-soluble molecules are polar, they won't pass through the membrane, so their receptor has to be on the membrane surface. Lipid-soluble molecules, however, can and do pass through the membrane because they're mainly hydrophobic. Okay? So they can pass through the membrane, so their receptors can be found on the inside of the cell. Okay? And because where the receptors are, these changes how the hormones elicit actions in the cell. Okay? Other hormones can be considered local hormones. Again, this is kind of a oxymoron. It's said that a hormone goes through the blood and goes everywhere. These particular hormones don't circulate through the blood. They stay in an area, but they do kind of work like a hormone, right? Because they bind neighboring cells or the cells that release them. Okay? So when one cell targets a cell near it, that is something we call paracrine secretion. So here, let's draw a cell, lovely cell here, okay, and another cell near it. All right? This cell produces the hormone that the receptor for that hormone has the receptor for that hormone. We didn't pass through the blood, but one cell 1, targeted cell 2. That's pretty close, right? That is what we call paracrine secretion. Okay, endocrine secretion uses the blood. Yes? Paracrine goes from one cell to a nearby cell, somewhere close. Okay? An autocrine secretion, is a little different. Let's say this cell number 1 produces a different hormone here. Okay, we call it a square. And it also actually expresses the receptor. So it produces the hormone, and the receptor is there, so it actually targets itself. That is what we call autocrine secretion. Paracrine is neighbors. It's like Molly hits Jackie. Okay? Or itself. Molly smacks herself in the face. Don't do that. I'm not just using it as an example. All right? So neighboring cells talk to each other, or you stimulate the cell that produces the hormone. Okay? Some other local hormones are what we call eicosanoids. Right? These are broken down from fatty acids within the phospholipid bilayer, and they're synthesized through an enzymatic cascade. Right? And one of these is prostaglandins. Right? Prostaglandins include things like what we call PGF2 alpha, which is important for ovulation. But these also are very important in inflammation. Okay? So this particular cascade of reactions that convert part of the phospholipids into an eicosanoid are regulated and facilitated by enzymes. Okay, so enzyme will start to break down a phospholipid, convert it into arachidonic acid. That then can be broken down into prostaglandins, thromboxanes, and leukotrienes. These are your eicosanoids. Okay, great, cool. What's the importance for that? Well, you may have heard of these things called NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Your lovely names of these commercial names include Advil, Aleve, Tylenol, right? Those are non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs, okay? And they prevent inflammation, okay? Typically in joints, actually could be anywhere, all right? But they prevent inflammation because the eicosanoids, the prostaglandins and thromboxanes, are actually the cells or the substances that trigger inflammation in your body. Okay? So not only are they used for headaches, but they're used to help like joint aches in that way. All right, so non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like aspirin, Advil, Tylenol, they are what we call COX-2 inhibitors. That's cyclooxygenase. That's the enzyme that converts arachidonic acid into these lovely things, which are important for inflammation. Steroid drugs like cortisone also are anti-inflammatories, but they trigger or they target a different enzyme. They trigger phospholipase A2, okay, which will prevent that from happening. Either way, that's how we can treat inflammation, right? We typically do it with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. Those are less potent, I guess, than steroids, right? Like if you have a long-term injury, arthritis, etc., you might get something like a cortisone shot. Have you heard of that? Cortisone shots are this, and they prevent the inflammation on the tissues based upon there, but you can only do it so much because it also causes other deterioration of tissues. But the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs are a little bit, less. Plenty functional, but not as harsh. All right, so autocrine, paracrine, and prostaglandins are eicosanoids. All right, so I mentioned that that blood is a water or an aqueous solution, right? Your blood is made up of roughly about 70 to 80% water, okay? And maybe about 45% are cells, and then the rest is like this watery substance, okay? So for hormones to travel via the blood, it's easy for water-soluble hormones to travel via the blood. They're in a watery solution. They're soluble that way. Lipid-soluble hormones, however, have to be carried. They don't function well in a watery solution because they're not water-soluble. So they'll tend to kind of like clump together if they're in the blood without any carrier. So lipid-soluble hormones like testosterone and estrogen, they travel via the blood on a carrier protein. Okay, so the protein in the blood, which is water-soluble, carries the hormone and helps keep it active, right? And that's where we can go. We can make a distinction between bound and free, right? So you may have a blood test if someone is has possible low hormone levels. They will measure free testosterone versus bound testosterone and have a distinction between those two. Okay, but that is lipid-soluble hormones, right? And the carrier helps extend the life of the hormone as well. How does the body regulate how much hormone is in the blood? Because how much hormone circulating in the blood is going to determine what the effects are, right? Someone who has low testosterone, well, it could be free, bound, whatever it might be. It's low, and that's going to lead to problems. If they have low growth hormone, they don't have enough in the blood to promote growth or of tissues, etc. Does that make sense? So how does the body regulate that? There's two different ways. How much is synthesized is our first way of saying regulating how much hormone is there, right? So if someone doesn't have a child as they're growing, right, and they kind of don't grow very high in stature, a endocrinologist may look for the levels of growth hormone, and they might not have enough. That is directly related to hormone synthesis. They're not producing enough, or they produce too much, right? So how much we synthesize is the first way of controlling how much is present in the body. The second way is how much is eliminated. So balancing these two, synthesis versus elimination, gives you how much hormone is present in the body or in the blood at any time. Okay? We want them to be balanced, okay, so that we can keep certain levels of growth hormone, testosterone, estrogen, thyroid hormone, etc., right, in order to promote the effects of the hormone on target cells. A half-life is like the measurement of how long a hormone lasts in the body. Technically, the definition of a half-life is how long it takes for half the amount of hormone to be eliminated from the body, or for half of it to break down. Okay? So, how much is it efficiently eliminated? Right? So shorter half-life. Things like water-soluble hormones have short half-lives, like insulin. It's produced, it's released, it breaks down really quickly, right? Because it does its effects pretty quick. Testosterone tends to have a longer half-life, right? And so testosterone's half-life is about 12 days. All right, so they work a little bit quicker. So, lipid-soluble hormones, because they are soluble in lipid and they are hydrophobic, they can easily pass through the membrane. Okay? So their mechanism of action, how it works, mechanism of action means how the hormone works. Okay? It's going to diffuse across the cell membrane, because it can, and bind to its receptor inside the cell and form what's called a hormone receptor complex. Okay? So like estrogen, a lipid-soluble hormone, right, will diffuse across the membrane and bind to the estrogen receptor on the interior within the cytoplasm of the cell. When that happens, the estrogen receptor, right, binds to another estrogen receptor that's bound to another hormone. And those two is what we call dimerizes. That group then goes to the nucleus and it binds to DNA and promotes DNA, mRNA transcription and protein synthesis. Okay, so it promotes gene expression. That is how a lipid-soluble hormone works. Testosterone, progesterone, estrogen, thyroid hormone all work in that mechanism. Does that make sense? Here's how this is a picture showing you how it works. Hormone in the blood attached to a carrier protein because it's a lipid-soluble hormone. It's then released, it becomes unbound, it diffuses out of the blood into the target cells around it. Right? So, and as it diffuses, there's no receptor on the membrane. It diffuses across the cell membrane because it's lipid-soluble and binds to its receptor on or within the cell, within the nucleus within the cytoplasm of the cell. When it binds and forms that hormone receptor complex, that then translocates or moves to the nucleus, binds to DNA, and promotes gene expression. So then we get mRNA, protein synthesis, and proteins, and now those proteins do what the cell wants. Think about testosterone. Testosterone is an anabolic steroid. It does this and helps promote your muscle cells producing protein and build more muscle. Okay? Questions on this mechanism of action. This is what we call the classical steroid hormone response. Okay? There's been plenty of research now that shows that there's actually membrane-bound receptors for steroid hormones as well, but they work in a different way. Okay? It's not the classical pathway. How is this going to be different from a water-soluble hormone? How do you think this will differ from what you might see in a water-soluble hormone? Zania. The receptor is going to have to be where? The receptor for the hormone is going to have to be on the outside. So then the question being, if the receptor is out here, how do we get the response inside the cell? Right? And if you remember, neurotransmitters can work in a direct or an indirect fashion. A direct fashion means that the neurotransmitter binds to the receptor. The receptor is a ion channel. It opens, ions move, we change membrane potential. Okay? All right. The indirect mechanism is very similar to what you will see here in the action for a water-soluble hormone. Right? The ligand binds to the receptor, neurotransmitter binds to its receptor, and then some other proteins or action happens inside the cell. Okay, so it's a second messenger has to relay the message inside the cell. The water-soluble hormone never actually gets inside the cell. All right, this is what we call a signal transduction pathway. And in that pathway, the hormone is your first messenger. So hormone is going to message to the target cell by binding to the receptor. Now, how is that message relayed to the cell? That is where we have this pathway. Okay? Many times, the receptor is associated or linked, or what we call coupled, to a thing called a G protein. Many of the water-soluble receptors are what we call G protein coupled receptors, or GPCRs. All right, so this G protein is going to end up doing something in response to the receptor being bound to the hormone. So hormone binds to the receptor, activates the G protein that's associated with it. And then from there, that G protein triggers the production of a second messenger. Your second messenger is what's inside the cell and happening inside, right? So something modifies something intracellular, okay? Examples of second messengers can be GTP, can be diacylglycerol, can be cyclic AMP, inositol phosphate triphosphate, phosphoinositol diphosphate, PIP2, yeah. Those are all examples of second messengers. Am I going to ask you to rattle off those names? No. Okay, that's a cellular communication class. If you're interested in it, it's really, really fun. It's really interesting. These things control lots of cellular activities like cancer, like development, like growth of cells, actions, you name it, right? This is all associated with that. Take the cellular communication class if you're interested in it. I'm not going to ask you to name those, but you should be familiar with a second messenger is. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's your G protein coupled receptors and how it works. What do we see here? Water-soluble hormone binds to its receptor. The receptor becomes activated. That receptor then activates the G protein. The G protein separates, and now it becomes, and it's going to trigger something else. And this is where we're going to talk about the other second messengers that happens inside the cell. Here's an example of them. All right? Adenylate cyclase. Adenyl cyclase, as I learned it. Okay? AC. That is an enzyme that converts and produces lovely things like cyclic AMP. What did I say cyclic AMP was? That was a second messenger. Okay? So a water-soluble hormone will bind to a receptor and trigger intracellular activity through the action of a second messenger. Okay? A lipid-soluble hormone will diffuse across the membrane, bind to its intracellular receptor, and cause changes in cellular activity inside the cell. Okay? No need for a second messenger in a lipid-soluble hormone. Okay? So phospholipase C splits PIP2 into diacylglycerol and inositol triphosphate. All of those have been shown to function as second messengers. Okay? Protein kinase C. What is a kinase? You remember that from muscles. We talked about creatine kinase. And a kinase is an enzyme that adds a phosphate group to something. Okay? A phosphate, or PO4, that group added to something usually makes it active or targets it for something. Okay? In the kinase activity versus a phosphatase activity, right? That usually means in the cellular world, when you add a kinase, it becomes an active molecule. So protein kinase C is an enzyme that adds phosphates to something. There's PKA, there's PKB, there's PKC, whatever, right? There's multiple ones. That doesn't matter. But the point of this is this becomes activated from a second messenger. Now it triggers more substances to be targeted and causes another level of activation. Does that make sense? So far, if you compare lipid-soluble, hormone goes through, binds the receptor, alters DNA transcription. Okay, you get protein synthesis. Okay, water-soluble hormone binds to its receptor, activates, causes a second messenger. Now the second messenger is free to activate lots of other things, right? So now all of a sudden, like it's like say for a second messenger, like Molly hits Jackie, and Jackie's the second messenger. Jackie turns around and whacks 5 people next to her. What just happened? The signal has been what? If we just went down the line, like one person touches the next and tags the next, and we go down the line, the signal's just linear, right? But if one part, let's say Jackie, because she's the target of my ire today, she decides instead of just keeping it linear, she tags 4 or 5 people around her, we've amplified the signal. Does that make sense? So water-soluble hormones allow for amplification of the signal, and on top of that, diversification, because we can target and activate a lot of different substances, right? So PLC pathway, right? Second messengers, activated protein, right? And this, right? Amplification is one of the advantages of a signal transduction pathway, right? We can amplify things. So like when we're giving growth hormone to someone, what are some of the outcomes of growth hormone? Well, bones grow, we reduce fat, muscles grow, right? Those are all different responses. And the cell responds to that growth hormone in multiple ways because of the amplification and diversification of the signal, okay? And it also allows for very intricate control of the signal itself. We can shut it down really quickly if we stop the second messengers. So think about everyone. So if I use my example of, the going down the line, Nyla, Molly, Jackie, over to Molly, Emma, right? We all go all the way down the line, right? At any one of those steps, I can say stop. You can stop that from happening, right? So the communication can stop at any one of those steps. So it gives lots of amplification of the signal, it can lead to diversification of the outcomes or the response of the cellular behavior, and it can also allow the cell to intricately control the activation. It can shut it off whenever necessary. All right, examples. Glucagon from the pancreas is one. All right, glucagon, water soluble. It works, binds to its receptor. What does it do? It activates, causes liver cells to increase cyclic AMP, which activates PKA. That phosphorylates a lot of enzymes, which leads to the release of glucose from the cell, the breakdown of glycogen and release of glucose into the blood. Oxytocin is released from the posterior pituitary. It binds to receptors in smooth muscle and causes contraction, right? And that also happens through the action of a second messenger. So, as I alluded to at the very beginning, what controls the response of a cell to a hormone? The presence of the receptor for that hormone. If a cell doesn't have the receptor, it can't respond to the hormone. Okay? So that's number one. How many of those receptors present also on the cell will determine what the level of response a cell will have to a hormone. The more receptors, more opportunities to bind, more action of the hormone on the cell. Okay? And then finally, we have interactions among those receptors. So our cells do not just have one hormone receptor on it, right? We have loads of them, right? Muscles, for example, have growth hormone receptors. They have testosterone, like androgen receptors. They have lots of things, right? And so the population of receptors on a cell, the interactions between them also determine how well the cell responds to the hormone signal. Sometimes multiple hormone receptors and hormones together will work together, like in muscle. Testosterone and growth hormone work together, build muscle. Straightforward, yes? That is what we call synergism. Multiple hormones, they target the target cell has receptors for both, and they work together to promote whatever cellular outcome we're talking about. Okay? The opposite to that, what happens if one hormone contradicts the action of another? That's antagonistic. Okay, so a cell will have the receptors for two hormones. One works against another, and they kind of prevent each other. All right, they work against one another. And then lastly, we have what's called permissive. It can happen, I'll allow it to happen. Right? Cell has receptors for multiple hormones. One doesn't care what the other one does. It kind of permits and allows the action of the first hormone to occur. It doesn't help it. It doesn't prevent it. It just is there, right? And I think for most of the time, like our cells probably have a permissive action. There's some places where they work together. There's some places where they work against one another. But a lot of times it's just a hormone's there, hormone receptor's there. Hormone's going to target a cell. It's going to do its job. Another hormone is going to target the same cell, and it's going to do its job kind of on their own, kind of separately. Okay? Does that make sense? Yes? Questions on the endocrine system up to there? No. Yes. Maybe.